right, what's up, YouTube? This is Edward Earl. Haven't been on here in quite some time, but I have some time freed up, so I'm gonna go ahead and do a video. I'm in this Facebook debate group, and I get these posts and these videos that come through my feed, and so I wanted to do a response to one of them. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen.
Now, if you do real research, everybody who has went on to study this whole thing and getting into the whole thing with the creation of the Bible. Now, if you're arguing biblical doctrine or biblical religion, especially with Hebrew Israelites, this is what you're getting into when you get into the scholarship of it. So for those of you who have looked, what did you find? You find, because you're trying to prove the authenticity of the Bible, which we cannot, because we're never going to have the originals or be able to prove that they even existed. So what we can prove is, one, if we can find proof that the Jews actually existed during a certain time prior, let's just say 4th century BCE, that they had a legacy and people talked about them, it gives more validity to the Bible itself.
All right, so let me just go ahead and stop there. So one of the things that I've noticed with conscious community folk, atheists, skeptics in general, is that they try to get rid of evidence. They want to get rid of evidence. They want to get rid of evidence that doesn't fit their presuppositions. They want to get rid of evidence that doesn't fit the hypothesis. When we're talking about atheists, whether you're talking about a materialistic worldview or a naturalistic worldview, they want to get rid of some data. They want to get rid of data that doesn't fit their worldview, such as free will. They will tell you that free will is illusory, that it's not real, that it doesn't exist. And the reason why they'll do that is because it doesn't fit into their worldview. And so skeptics of the Bible, they want to get rid of the Bible. But the Bible is an ancient artifact, right? Any hypothesis that you have, it has to take account of that literature, and it has to explain it. And so no one is trying to get rid of Egyptian funerary texts. Okay, those exist. And so any hypothesis needs to explain all of the data. Okay. And so that's one piece of evidence. You also have the Manetho stela, which is another piece. That's many other lines of evidence, but just those two alone are independent attestations of this people group. And so any skeptic that wants to overturn that data, you know, they have a huge burden of proof. And other than that, the case is closed on that.
So what you had when you start to look, what did you find? You find a bunch of scholars who were trying to prove the existence of Jews. So understand, as I tell the Hebrews, when Kemet fell, part of the Egyptian empire was Israel. It stretched all the way over to Israel. So they came into Israel, they conquered Israel, which was full of African people, Egyptians, black people. I talked about Tunis, I talked about, Tyre or Tyrus. We know it was Africans there, all this was conquered, right? So when they conquered these lands and they started to implement Hellenization, which Hellenization is basically the spreading of this, what we call the Jewish doctrine. So they took these Africans and made them Jews, Hebrews.
All right, so let's stop there. So again, anytime I'm dealing with the conscious community, I have to I got to turn into Professor Edward Earl, right? And I have to school them on logic, okay? So logic is objective. I had a conversation with one fellow. He thought that the laws of logic were created by the Greeks, okay? And so this fellow here, let me just say this. There's laws of logic, and there's one particular law called the law of identity. It states that any specific thing is identical to itself, right? A is identical to A. B is identical to B. And so when we talk about Hellenization is the adoption of the Greek culture the adoption of the Greek language, the adoption of the Greek religion, the adoption of the Greek identity by non-Greeks. Okay, so to try to twist that and turn it into Hellenization is the spreading of the Jewish doctrine is a violation of the law of identity. And then he goes on and talks about this day, this mysterious day, right? Who he didn't identify who this day was. They took these Africans and turned them into to Hebrews or turned them into Jews or whatever. And this is another violation of the law of identity. Okay, but it's hard to talk to these conscious folks, um, logically because it's like logic just goes right over their head.
So anybody that's doing research on the Jews, the Hebrews, you know, 4th century BCE, if you're looking for anything, on the Jews prior to 4th century BCE, there's only 4 sources that you can really go to. 4. And of those 4 sources, only one has real tangible, evidence that you can really believe. And he's the only one that everybody really goes to. So this is how you can break this stuff down. This is how you know who's who and who's doing the research. Because anything anybody said besides these 4 people is pseudo. It's bullshit. It's iffy. So these 4 people are the suspect one. I start with him first. Josephus, right? Josephus. Then you have Aristobulus. Then you have Diodorus Siculus, who this is largely about what Merkin wrote it. And then you have Hecataeus. Hecataeus and Diodorus is basically the primary people that he's sourcing for this book that Merkin wrote, because that's who you have to source. If you arguing with somebody about this and they're not citing, which the Hebrews will not, they won't, and you're going to find out why in a second. If they're not citing Hecataeus and Diodorus Siculus, forget it, because it's pseudo. It's pseudo. We're gonna get into this in a second, but understand that. So you have Hecataeus, who is a large part of this book. He was 25 years old when Kemet fell. So he had 25 years of seeing Kemet being ruled by Egyptians. 25 years of that. And I believe he died in 550 BC. So he had 25 years, or that's when Kemet fell, was 550. So he knew, he had knowledge. Hecataeus understood what was going on. He's a historian. Look him up, he's a Greek historian. And he has 2 very important works that everybody knows about when you start researching this guy, Hecataeus. So you have Yanela, which Yanela basically means genealogy. Yanela Greek means genealogy, right? So Yanela genealogy, and Storia. So Storia is basically your history. So Storia.
All right, so I just want to stop it right here for a second. So, and I'm going to let him continue this conversation on Hecataeus, but let me just back up a little bit and tell you what this video is actually about. And so, sounds like my phone. All right, so let me just say this. So this guy here, right? So he's going to talk about 2 books, right? One book is uh Berossus and Genesis, Manetho, and Exodus. And then he's going to also talk about a book, Plato and the creation of the Hebrew Bible. And so this is from an author that his thesis is that the Hebrew Bible was created at the time of the Septuagint, or there was no precursor to the Septuagint, but that the Hebrew Bible was created at that time, right? It was originally in Greek and not originally in Hebrew. One of his main premises in the books is that there's no evidence, right? There's no evidence of the written Pentateuch prior to the Septuagint. And so that's his basic premise. Um, that supports his thesis. And so this fella here is, he's basically co-signing the two books. Okay. Now, here's the problem when you have confirmation bias. And that's literally what this is. This is confirmation bias. This is this guy here, this conscious community fella, um, who rejects the Bible, rejects Christianity, and rejects Judaism, and all of that. All right. I'm not sure if he's atheist or not, but he rejects these things. And so he goes and he looks for things that are going to confirm his biases. Okay. It doesn't matter if he reads them or not. As long as he sees that these things disagree, he's going to co-sign them. He's going to put up a video and put these things forth as facts. But if you listen to what he's saying right now, you can tell that he didn't read either of these books, because this Hecataeus that he's talking about is the wrong one. He's talking about Hecataeus of Miletus. But if you read the books, the author is talking about Hecataeus of Abdera. And so I don't want to call him a fool, but this dude doesn't even know that he doesn't know what he's talking about. And the thing about it is, it tells you that he didn't read the book, but here he is co-signing the author of the book. But anyway, let me just let him continue. Even though he's talking about a totally different dude, these two Hecataeuses are from two totally different centuries. One of them is from 5th century, and one of them is from the 4th century. So almost 200 years different, maybe 200 years apart. And he has them totally confused. So anyway, let him just go ahead on his foolishness for a little while, before I cut him off again.
Greek history, that's where we get story, storia, Yanela genealogy. That's his book. That's what it translates into. The most important book is his one that's basically on his journey, the journey that he fucking took supposedly around the world, which is,
yeah, again, he's talking about the wrong dude.
It's pronounced Periostos Gamma Sigma. Periostos Gamma Sigma. I got to say it a couple times to get it out. But it basically means journey around the world. So you have these important books by Hecataeus. And he's known for these books because he supposedly traveled and did this research on these civilizations of people, which is why he must be cited. So now the whole thing is, of course, you have Hecataeus, who was born, around the time the Egyptians was ruling. And here's a guy who lived through,
again, he's in the wrong century,
the rulership of the Egyptians and lived through the conquest of the Persians. Now, if this dude was an historian and he traveled the world, as it says with his books, he supposed to have traveled the world and everything like that, and did a genealogy and all this, at some point he had to speak to Jews. There's no way he could not have spoken to Jews or Hebrews. He had to have, and he had to have mentioned them. Now, according to Theodorus, he never mentions them. He never says that he spoke to any Jews. In fact, he says that what he heard about the Jews came from the Egyptians, which makes it even more suspect that how could you not
bro? We heard what you said, but you talking about the wrong dude.
have spoken to any Jews. And so when you look, you find these philosophers and researchers, Greeks, trying to prove this existence, right? So that's what you find. There's quite a few expensive books on this whole thing. And it says, Plato, in the creation of the Hebrew Bible, for the first time compares the ancient law collections of the ancient Near East, the Greeks, and the Pentateuch to determine the...
Okay, so let me just stop right here right now. So right now he's introducing those two books that I talked about. He's going to give the thesis of those two books. And then after he does that, after and you could, like I said, you could tell that he didn't read the book. So he went and took a review of the book and put the review up. He didn't come from his own notes or, him investigating the book himself, but yet he's co-signing it. Okay. So once he does that, I'm going to go ahead and refute the points of the book. Well, actually, both books.
Legal antecedents, which basically means the precursor for the biblical laws. Following on from his 2006 work, Berossus and Genesis, Manetho and Exodus, Merkin takes up his theory that the Pentateuch was written around 270 BCE using Greek sources found at the Library of Alexandria, and applies this to an examination of biblical law codes. A striking number of legal parallels are found between the Pentateuch and Athenian laws, and specifically with those found in Plato's law of circa 350.
All right, so let me just say this real quick. Okay, so the author had two books, right? So he has a volume 1 and a volume 2. So volume 1 is Berossus and Genesis, Manetho, and Exodus, right? And so in the thesis of the book, he's saying that the writers of the Hebrew Bible plagiarized Berossus for Genesis and plagiarized Manetho for Exodus, right? But and within that volume, and I'm going to get into how scientists and historians use a certain method to see which hypothesis best fits the data. Okay, so we're going to get into that. But, and one of the things I mentioned earlier is that any hypothesis should be able to explain all of the data, right? And so looking at Berossus and Manetho doesn't explain the laws, right? Doesn't explain all of the Levitical laws and the moral laws and the dietary laws and all of that. And so it doesn't explain it. And so that's why he came out with his second volume of Plato's laws, because now he's saying, okay, because my first hypothesis, my first thesis doesn't cover this part, let's come up with something else. Oh, Plato's laws cover the laws. And so now he's thinking that he has a full comprehensive thesis to explain the Pentateuch. But I'm going to show how, we're going to look at all of his lines of evidence one by one, and I'm going to show you why they are flawed and what they actually tell us about his thesis.
BCE. Constitutional features in biblical law, Athenian law, and Plato's laws also contain close correspondences. Several genres of biblical law, including the Decalogue, are shown to have striking parallels with Greek legal collections, and the synthesis of narrative and legal context is shown to be compatible with Greek literature. All this evidence points to direct influence from Greek writings, especially Plato's law, on the biblical legal tradition. Finally, it is argued that the creation of the Hebrew Bible took place according to the program found in Plato's laws for creating a legally authorized national ethical literature, reinforcing the importance of this specific Greek text to the authors of the Torah and Hebrew Bible in the early Hellenistic era. This study offers a fascinating analysis of the background of the Pentateuch and will be of interest not only to biblical scholars but also to students of Plato, ancient law, and Hellenistic literary traditions. Now here's basically the review of what one of these researchers wrote about Reed and Merkin's findings.
Okay, so again, now he's going to put up a review of the book, okay? Because he can't give you his review of the book because he didn't read it.
And this is basically what they said to sum it up. It says, the thesis is therefore clear. The Pentateuch is a Greek work inspired by Greek sources. Understand, the Pentateuch is a Greek work inspired by Greek sources. It just piss some Hebrew off if they're watching it. The book is constructed in 6 chapters each, followed by bibliographs relating to that chapter. An index of sources and an index of authors closes the volume. It says, thus, the thesis that the author pursues in this sequel of the first volume is that the Pentateuch in its legal parts is inspired by Platonic sources to which the 70, if you understand the letters of Orestes, the 70 Jews, had access in the great library of Alexandria. The argument is simple and comparative. The greater number of Pentateuchal laws, even if they had some Semitic precursors, seem copied from the Athenian law, or more precisely, the Platonic laws. Beyond this argument, the author proposes that the laws of Plato constitute a new hermeneutical, which basically means interpretation, a new hermeneutical key for the ideology not only of the Pentateuch, but the whole of the Bible. The Bible is the official national literature mandated according to the same instructions of the Platonic laws. If you understand that, that is big. So understand Merkin.
Okay, so that's it. So now let's go ahead and look at the evidence that the author is putting forward. Okay, so his first line of evidence is he's going to talk about Hecataeus, because Hecataeus is one of the first historians that actually talks about the Jews. Okay, and so he needs to get rid of Hecataeus, right? Because right away it totally destroys his argument. Because within Hecataeus, he talks about Moses, the lawgiver, right? He talks about the Jews coming out of Egypt, talking about the Exodus. I mean, he doesn't necessarily spell out the Exodus, but he's saying that they came out of Egypt and they went and they colonized Jerusalem, right? He was a lawgiver. There was 12 tribes, right? So Hecataeus talks about all of this, and we're talking about Hecataeus of Abdera, Hecataeus of Miletus, okay, which is how he totally screwed up these two dudes. Okay, and so what this guy is doing is he's using a double, the fallacy of the double inference, right? So he's using some of Hecataeus, but he's throwing some of it away, right? He's basically saying that Hecataeus is not really Hecataeus, um, that it's pseudo, it's from the first century, and it's not, from the fourth century, which is what most historians regard it as such, which is why they don't think, that's why they didn't come to the same conclusions that he comes to, that um that the Hebrew Bible was created in Greek times. They don't come to that conclusion because they accept Hecataeus. Or at least that's one of the reasons. There's a whole bunch of reasons which we're going to lay out as we look through the evidences. And so, as we go through this, you're going to see that he does that a lot. He uses the fallacy of you know the double inference. So in other words, he comes to the conclusion using different inferences to the same thing. So you know he's selective on what part of Hecate he wants to take and what parts of it he wants to throw away. He does that throughout his arguments, right? So the second line is, um, let's look at Berossus, right? So he's saying that the writers of Genesis use Berossus, um, Babylonica, uh, to come up with Genesis, right? Which is not a new argument. Um, the part of it that's new is that the time of it, like a lot of other scholars will say that there's some dependence, but it's based on, um, maybe something that the Jews found in Babylon, when they were in captivity. Whereas he's saying that they discovered this information at the Library of Alexandria. Okay, so that's kind of the difference. But both of those arguments fail because first of all, you know, you have to prove dependence, number one, even though there may be some similarities. I read this book called um Among the Myths. I think that's the name of it. I think that's the name of the book. I could be wrong about the name. But anyway, he talks about these comparisons between um different literature, right? Myths versus history. And one of the things that he mentions is that you have to look at the essentials versus the accidentals. So when you're comparing two different uh, genres or two different types of literature, there are things that are essentially different, and there are things that are accidentally different. There are things that are essentially the same, and there are things that are accidentally the same. And so, what he means by essential, the essential parts of of a worldview, or the essential parts of a framework, are the things that make it what it is. If you take the essentials out, then you don't have the religion, right? So when you're talking about Judaism versus Egyptian myth, or Mesopotamian myths, um, what makes it what it is are the essentials. Okay, so when we look at these similarities, are the similarities in the essentials, or are the similarities in the accidentals? Okay, so let's look at that. And in this book that I'm talking about, um, he used two different ways of explaining the differences. So one he called continuity, which is the pagan version of the world, like how they saw the world, versus transcendence, which is the way that the Jews saw the world, or at least the biblical writers, because we obviously know that a lot of the Jews, even according to the scriptures, they worship multiple gods. Okay, we can concede that, if anyone is arguing that, we can concede that because it's literally in the scriptures. Okay, so the difference between continuity and transcendence, right? So continuity is the idea that everything is within the divine, right? It's pantheism, which is very similar to pantheism, right? Everything is one, or the all, whatever you want to call it. Everything exists together. Everything is a part of itself. And the underlying principle of all of that is that it's matter. Okay. The underlying principle of that is matter. And so that goes back to materialism, right? Which I talked about a little bit earlier. Okay. So this is an ancient idea. Um, and also polytheism versus monotheism. Okay. Now in these this Mesopotamia myths, uh, again, matter is the base. The gods came out of the matter, right? The gods came out of the matter. Versus in the Bible, uh, God created the matter. It's totally different. Okay. And they're both essentials, right? They're both essentials, but they're essentially different. They're not essentially the same. They're accidentally the same. So in other words, some of the similarities might be the way that, like it talks about this first, and then second is this, and then third is that, and then fourth is this. Last they created the humans. So that is accidentally similar. But those are not essentials. Those are accidentals. If you want to, have an argument that somebody plagiarized something, or somebody is dependent on something, then you need to identify the essential similarities, not the accidental similarities. Okay, so one of the differences we talk about um, is the view of humans, right? So in some of these Mesopotamia uh, myths, there was a low view of humans, right? Humans were basically tears, tears of atom, right? They were created to feed the gods. They were created to minister to the gods, right? They were afterthought, all right? But in the biblical creation account, uh, humans were created in the image of God. Humans are the apex of God's creation, right? Humans were created to have dominion over all of the other creation. See, those are essentials within the biblical worldview, that humans are created in the image of God. Okay, and that's where human dignity comes from. That's an essential. Those two different views are essentially different. They're not essentially the same. They are essentially different. Okay. And so anybody who wants to claim that one is dependent on the other, you have to show essentially similarity, not essentially differences, or not accidental similarity. Okay. Here's another difference. This is something that's essential, right? Ethics. Okay, so from the biblical standpoint, uh, goodness is inherent to God. Like, right, it's a part of who He is. It's a part of God's character. It's a part of God's nature, goodness, and that's where ethics flow from the nature of God, right? And these other myths, there's ethics is relative, right? Because one God believes this, the other God believes something totally different, right? Well, one God thinks it's evil, the other God thinks it's good, and not only that, the gods themselves are evil. And so there is no absolute or objective morality, right? It's all relative. This is, it all depends on the day. It all depends on how they woke up and how they felt that day. Okay, so those are essentially different. They're not essentially the same. They're essentially different. Meaning, it's the if you take those apart, the whole entire worldview falls apart because they're essential to the worldview. Okay, they're totally different. Um, when you talk about sexual, right? So in a lot of these myths, a lot of these Egyptian myths, or Babylon, the Babylon myths, the gods were made through sex, sexually, Osiris and Horus and that whole group, you know what I'm saying? They having sex with brothers and sisters and doing all kind of crazy stuff, right? And having each other and it being born from these things. And so, they're having intercourse, right? But in the biblical account, there's none of that. Like God is not sexual at all. God is spirit, right? And in the New Testament, the Son is not God's child, but God Himself, right? He's God in human flesh, right? The Holy Spirit overshadowed the woman. It was no sex involved, despite what some people want to allude to and creating these caricatures. There's no sex involved, right? And in the Bible, sex is sacred in marriage, right? There's no, it doesn't glorify sex outside of marriage. Like it's only sacred within marriage. Okay. And then, another essential is the creation itself. Like Enuma Elish, it's not even a creation account at all, right? But it's an emergence of things, right? Chaos, right? These emerge, right? In the creation account in the Bible, God actually creates the world, right? He creates, you know, all of these things and puts them together, right? Like in these other accounts, matter is essential and it's already there. It already exists, right? And then lastly, like where did these accounts even take place? Like in the Genesis account, it's attempts to place it somewhere on Earth, right? There's some reference points to where the Garden of Eden was, right? Reference points that we can actually see on a map, as opposed to some of these other myths where it's totally not in this world. There's nowhere you can find it. It's not on any map that you could possibly find. Okay, so right away, like his first or second evidence is like, it's based on Berossus' account of the Mesopotamian myths. Totally fails because they're essentially different. Okay, and if you want to prove otherwise, you need the burden of proof is on the skeptic. Okay, so the third evidence that he wants to point out is the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. Right. So he mentions this, right? But he wants to dismiss it. So basically, he acknowledges the fact that archaeology has verified the antiquity of these chronicles, right? These accounts of these kings. There's plenty of evidence of these kings and some of the accounts within the text. And so these same texts talk about the Torah. These same accounts talk about the Pentateuch. These same accounts talk about the law. And so from the author's standpoint, he wants to get rid of this. So again, he has this double standard of inference, right? Where he can pick and choose, he can basically pick and choose what's real and what's anachronistic. What do they put in there versus what was already there, right? And there's no evidence for him to support what he's saying. He just picks and choose, what's historical and what's not. So if it mentions the Torah, if it mentions the Lord, then that's something that they added. But everything else that's backed up archaeology, oh, that's legit. That's no way to do scholarship. Okay, that's pseudo. That's pseudo. You can't just pick and choose what's what. Okay, to base your hypothesis on. It just doesn't work that way, right? And I'm gonna, once I'm done going through these evidence, I'm gonna actually lay out how scientists and historians actually do it, and then we're gonna take this same evidence that I'm talking about, and we're gonna plug it in to see which hypothesis is better, right? We're gonna do exactly what the scholars do. Okay, we're not gonna do some emotional, I believe the Bible, so I just want it to be true. No, we're going to actually do it in a scholarly way so everyone who's viewing can see that this actually makes more sense than what this guy is saying in these two books. Okay. So then he talks about the language forms, right? So you have classical Hebrew versus late biblical Hebrew, right? And so scholars use that to date texts, okay? But he wants to use his double standard of inference again. He wants to take some and throw some out, okay? And he actually, he doesn't talk a lot. He doesn't talk about it a lot in the book. He just basically mentions it. He mentions it like yeah, we can't really trust this because, you know, um, what did he say? Oh, because in the book of Ezra, and I'll put up the um his quote up on the screen so you can actually read it for yourself. Because I might be saying it wrong. I don't have it right in front of me. But he basically says that, some of this late biblical Hebrew is in Ezra, and Ezra could be from the, 100 BC. And so we got to take that with a grain of salt. We don't really have much evidence about this, you know, late, the late biblical Hebrew versus the classical. And so he basically wants to say that, we can't really use this to prove anything. So he just wants to throw it out. Let's just explain this away. But in reality, like the example that he gave is from like 1600 BC, when he's talking about late biblical Hebrew. But that doesn't support his idea that the Bible was written um in the third century BC. That's a couple of hundred years difference. But he doesn't give any account for it. He just says it as if it bolsters his argument, when in reality it doesn't. It actually argues against what he's saying. So he talks about, and I think that this is one of the daggers in his whole argument, right? So he talks about, he agrees with the fact that there's no Greek loanwords in the in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, and he kind of wants to dismiss that too because he says that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Hebrew, there's no Greek loanwords. Okay, and again, he's saying this as if it boasts his argument, but it actually goes against his argument. Because if you're going to say that they created this um in Greek times, right? And we have and I'm gonna get to the Elephante Pyre, um, they have Greek loanwords in them, and it's from the 5th century BC, right? So we're talking about the 3rd century, and there's no Greek loanwords in there. Okay. Now the thing with me is, I try to make arguments that are really logical. And I know that sounds like a argument from silence, but here's what actually brings it home, from our perspective, right? So, like I told you before, his main premise of all of these, both of these books, and every argument that he makes within them is that there's no evidence of the Hebrew Bible prior to the Septuagint. So it sounds to me like the argument is that the very first, because the Septuagint must be the first one, right? So it was originally created in Greek. Okay. Now, if it was originally created in Greek and then you actually translated it into Hebrew, then that should mean that there were going to be some loan words from the Greek since it's coming from Greek. Okay. But on top of that, the Hebrew, right? So if it's being translated, the Hebrew doesn't have any. But when you actually look at the Septuagint, it actually has Hebrew loan words in it. Hundreds. There's hundreds of Hebrew loan words in the Septuagint. Okay, which speaks directly to the fact that there's a precursor, that there is a Hebrew Bible prior to the Septuagint that they translated into, because there's Hebrew loan words. What makes more sense? That there's going to be Hebrew loan words in the Septuagint, right? If the Septuagint is the original, or that there would be uh Greek loan words in the Hebrew if the Septuagint is the original. Okay, so whatever one is the original, there should be loan words in the translation. Okay, there's loan words in the Septuagint, which history is saying is a translation, but there's no loan words in Hebrew, where he is saying that that is the actual translation. It's coming from Greek to Hebrew. And so that's a dagger in his argument. Because wait a minute, there's no loan words in the Hebrew, but there's loan words in the Septuagint, which is supposed to be the original, according to this guy. Yeah, I think that that's a dagger. All right, so he talks about the priestly prayer, the Ketiv Hanem, dated from 600 BC. Right? He wants to throw that out and say, "Oh, that doesn't have anything to do with the Book of Numbers." It's la 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 la. And again, that's his double inference fallacy. So I get to choose and pick and choose what's legit and what's not. If it doesn't line up with my argument, then I'm just going to throw it out. Okay. He talked about the Elefante papyrus, right? And he's using these things as evidence for him when in reality it's totally the opposite. Because first of all, right, they talk about the Passover in the papyrus, right? They talk about the Passover. If there's no, what the heck is the Passover? The Passover has to do with the Exodus, period. That's what it is. It existed back in the 5th century. And so you have to explain that. He doesn't explain that at all. He doesn't explain that at all. He's saying, oh, well, they weren't the ones who mentioned it, but it doesn't matter if they mention it or not, because we don't know the whole entire conversation, right? They could have asked for permission. It was soldiers, right? They wanted leave to celebrate this Passover, and now they're getting permission for it. That's basically what the letter is saying. They're getting permission to celebrate the Passover. Oh, what is Passover? According to him, it didn't exist until the 3rd century. And so this folks holds all in his argument. Yeah, he wants to try to use this as evidence for his thesis, but it doesn't work. All right, so he talks about Manetho, so the same way with Berossus, they're plagiarizing Manetho. Okay, but again, you have to show the dependence. You have to show the dependence. You can't just show similarities, essential similarities. Okay, because most historians is going to tell you that the Hyksos are not the Israelites. I mean, that's a story for another day. I'm not going to get that much into it. But again, Hecate talks about them coming out of Egypt. Hecate talks about the 12 tribes. Hecate talks about Moses being the lawgiver and all of those things. Prior to Manetho. Okay. So again, you have to explain all of that. Okay, and then so last he talks about Plato. Okay. And this is the second volume of the book where he talks about Plato and talks about Plato's laws and all of those things. Um, and I actually have I think I have like five examples from Plato, um, which kind of refute this argument because basically he's saying that the laws of Moses come from Plato, right? At least that's the main thesis, but he kind of goes back and forth on that. And so I'm going to share my screen again and just pull up this argument that I have here because I don't remember it by heart. Okay, here it is here. All right, so let's go ahead and look at this Plato stuff. Okay, so here's a quote from his book, right? So he says, uh, Plato, no, I'm sorry, the office of king as described in the Torah of the kings appears to have been conceived along democratic Greek lines. Kingship, when it existed among the Greeks, was often an elected position. Deuteronomy. Okay, so he's saying that the kings, it's an elected position, and you can tell that he probably he never read the Bible, right? I don't know where he got this idea from, because he's saying that um the Hebrew idea of a king was supposed to be elected. Okay, but if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 17, which I have here, it says, "When he is seated on his royal throne, he is to write a copy of the instruction for himself on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priest is to remain with him, and he is to read it from the days in all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to observe all the words of this instruction, and to do these statutes. Then his heart will not be exalted above his countrymen. He will not turn from this commandment to the right or to the left, and he and his sons will continue to reign many years in Israel. And so, from the beginning of the Constitution of Israel, they perceived that the kingship would pass from son to son, or from father to son. That's literally what it says here. And he and his sons will continue reigning many years. Okay, so he's conceiving of something totally different. He's saying that it was supposed to be some type of elected position where after one king dies, they elect a new king, and that's not what happened in the books of the kings, and it's not what was at the beginning when they actually laid this down in Deuteronomy. And so, you know, this is totally ridiculous what he's saying here. And it just goes to show you that he didn't even read what something that he is sourcing. And that's one thing that he did. He didn't put the scriptures in his book at all. I don't remember seeing any. And I read both books, unlike the genius who made that video. Okay, so number two, he says, he gives an example. The biblical liability of the guilty party for the position cost and loss of income during a period of recuperation in the case of assault appears to be another instance of literary dependence on ancient Near Eastern law. Okay, so again, he's picking and choosing. So either the biblical laws are based on Plato or they're not. So now he's equivocating here. Oh, even though it's based on Plato, it's also based on the ancient Near East. Well, which one is it? Which one is it? Right. So I even wrote a note. It says, so here another supposition has to be added. Since this particular item cannot fit in the explanation of Plato's laws, it needs to be dependent on the A&E literature. Okay, so his hypothesis doesn't fit all of the information. It doesn't fit all of the data, which is one of the things that I talked about in the beginning of this video. Usually they either try to throw it away or they explain it away. Okay, but it doesn't fit. If it's Plato's laws, then why is it this not one of Plato's laws? Why is it ancient Near East? All right, so another one. It says the Pentateuch thus created numerous links between the new monotheistic religion of the Jews and Samaritans and the ancient god cultic sites, religious laws, and priesthood of the land. The Pentateuch also sought to incorporate ancient legal traditions into the new, mostly Greek Mosaic law. So again, which one is it? So now you're saying, okay, even though it's based on Plato, it also has ancient gods and all this, all ancient traditions and all of this. Well, which one is it? Excuse me. Which one is it? Now it's both, right? So when it looks like Greek, it's Greek, but then when it's not, doesn't look like Greek, it's something else. Another double inference fallacy. Which one is it, bro? Your hypothesis doesn't explain all of the data. You have to use all of these additional suppositions. Here's another example. The Pentateuch thus employs a number of strategies that sought to forge a link between the new laws of the founded Jewish and Samaritan nation and the religious institutions and traditions of the forefathers. Okay. Again, he's mixing and matching again. Because he can't get away from what looks ancient, right? These ancient things that match with the ancient Near East, while he's trying to say that it's from Plato. It doesn't link up. It doesn't match his hypothesis. His hypothesis doesn't match the information as much as he's trying to make it fit. Okay. Okay. So yeah. So let me read the rest of this because it gets good at the end. So he says about the forefathers, right? Sorry. All right. So it says, but although the Pentateuch appeared to endorse traditional gods and cultic institutions, some of which were associated with the polytheistic Canaanite pantheon, the Pentateuch also sought to reform them. The older gods of the land were consolidated into a single new deity who closely resembled the one eternal, supremely creator God of Plato's writing. Okay, so now he gets into uh, Plato's theology proper. Okay, what Plato actually thought about God. So again, he gets it wrong because, I think I wrote this note afterwards. It says the problem with this is Plato didn't have one supreme God in his writings. According to Plato, nous was the intellect or the intelligence behind the cosmos, but he also had a deity which he identified with the form of the good. Okay, so he had at least two deities in his writings, and they were distinct. They weren't the same. Aristotle actually looked at them as the same. The intelligence and the good, right, the form of the good, they were one God, right? But in Plato, they were two different. They were distinct. And I actually highlighted some information from Aristotle and Plato on God as knowns and as the good. Okay, so they were different in their thought on those two aspects. Okay, so you could take a look at that. I'm not going to quote it. You could look at it there. I have it there. And then also in Plato's writing, there had temples. There was no temple in the Pentateuch at all. And so again, his argument fails to um, reflect the facts. Okay, so the last thing I want to do on this video, let me stop sharing. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about on this video is scholars, whether we're talking about historians or if we're talking about um, scientists, right? They often use. I thought I brought that here, but I don't need it. I don't know. They normally use criteria to come to hypotheses. Okay, and they oftentimes use six criteria. Okay, which I'm going to explain right now. Okay, so the first one is explanatory scope, and I talked about this a lot in this video here. Explanatory scope is basically means the hypothesis that explains most of the data. Okay, a good hypothesis should explain, and I've said this over and over in this video, it should explain most of the data, right? If there's 13 lines of evidence, the hypothesis that explains the most of it is going to be the best one. It's just like if you're a detective and you're trying to solve a case and you have a hypothesis of who committed the crime, okay, one of them, your fingerprints is on the gun, right? They were on it at the scene of the crime when it happened, okay, um, and they have motive, right? And so when the hypothesis that they did it explains all of the data, right? If you have someone else who, maybe their fingerprints was also on it on the gun, on the weapon, but they were in another place. They have an alibi. They didn't have a motive, right? So even though the hypothesis that they did it explains some of the data, it doesn't explain all of it. And so the one that actually explains all of it is the better one. And so when we look at the data, right? When we look at all of these evidences that I laid out, right? And these are all from this guy, right? I didn't even give any positive evidence to refute his arguments. I just took what he put in his book. Okay. So when we talk about the loan words, the Greek loan words, the Hebrew loan words, right? What it best explains those? What best explains those is the fact that there's a Hebrew Bible before the Septuagint. Excuse me, the fact that Hecataeus is saying that there was a lawgiver, right? And that there was 12 tribes and that they went into Egypt, right? It's best explained by the biblical account. The fact that there's a biblical artifact that's saying these things is best explained by these things actually happen, right? So The biblical account explains all of the data with a simple hypothesis that these things happen, right? It explains everything. Like these scholars have to go, and I'm going to get to some of these other some of these other criteria. So six of them. So the first one is explanatory scope, and it basically means which hypothesis explains most of the data or all of the data. Okay, so which one explains all of it the best, right? The next one is explanatory power, right? So which one explains it better? Okay, which hypothesis explains the data better, right? Because that's the whole point of an hypothesis. It explains something. It explains something that we see. It explains an observation. It explains some data. It explains some evidence, right? What best explains it is explanatory power. Okay. The fact that there's a people group, and like I said, there's a whole bunch of information that I didn't put into this video because I didn't want it to be so long, right? But the explanation that explains it best, right, and simply is going to be the better one. What best explains why there are no loan words in the Greek? Why there are no Greek loan words? What best explains that? What best explains is that the Greek language, when it was written, the Greek language wasn't the lingua franca, right? It wasn't the main language that was going on at the time, right? It wasn't in Greek times. It wasn't originally in Greek. Okay. What best explains why the Septuagint has all of these Hebrew loan words? Oh, because that was a Hebrew precursor to the Septuagint. Simple as that. Just like history records that the Septuagint was a translation from the Hebrew Bible. That explains it. Okay. So the third one is plausibility. Okay. Which one is more plausible? When we're talking about competing hypotheses, plausibility is a huge one. Which one is more plausible? Right? That you know, the Hecate knew what he was talking about, or that he didn't. What's more plausible? The dude is a historian. I love how people like to throw historians out when it's convenient for them. But then if it agrees with them, then they go with it. I guarantee you, if the Septuagint, so if the Hebrew Bible had a bunch of Greek loan words in there, that would be the number one evidence that it was created in Greek times. That would be the number one evidence. Even Daniel, the book of Daniel has three Greek loan words, and you hear all these arguments about it. Only three. Three. Okay. The Elefante papyrus has Greek loanwords in it from the 5th century. Okay. Then you have three. And the arguments. It was in Greek times, it was in the 2nd century. Okay. But here you have the Hebrew Bible, no Greek loanwords, and he just wants to just totally dismiss that. Is that plausible? What's more plausible? Okay, plausibility. Um, the next one is ad hocness. And I love this one. This is my favorite, I believe. I love explanatory scope too, and explanatory power. This might be my favorite one. Ad hocness. So what that means is, does the hypothesis need additional suppositions to explain the evidence? And this goes back to explanatory scope, because explanatory scope is the explanation that explains most of the data, right? Ad hocness is you have to add additional suppositions to explain the information that's not explained by the hypothesis. So in other words, you have to explain, you have to give more explanations and more explanations. Whereas the better hypothesis is just one explanation that explains everything. This one you have to come up with more rescuing devices. Oh, well, the reason why there's no loan words is because and the reason why Hecate said this is because it's not really him. And yeah, that's ad hocness. You got to add additional supposition to explain something away. That's what that is. That's a weakness in the hypothesis. And when you got to throw stuff away, when you got to explain it away, yes, that's a weakness. That shows you that it's not a good hypothesis. Okay. How many is that? I think that's four. The next one is not disconfirmed, meaning that it's not some supernatural thing. Like so, you know, When you're talking about something that's supernatural, it's not something that can be confirmed by the scientific method, and so it's a little bit more difficult to confirm it. Okay, um, and so that's a criteria that scientists and historians use. Okay, but none of these things that we're talking about are supernatural at all. All of these are natural things. You know, a book being written at a certain time is natural as could be. There's nothing supernatural about writing a book. Okay. Um, and then lastly, number six, which one best explained all of these five? Like which one exceeds, if one hypothesis exceeds the other one in these other five, then it's a better hypothesis. So those are the six. And as I showed out in this whole entire video, the hypothesis that this dude put forth, that it was created in the Greek times at, in 300, 279 BC, it just doesn't fit the data. Okay. He has to create all kinds of suppositions to explain it. And then back to the dude who created the video again. He didn't read the books. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's talking about the wrong hectares. He doesn't have a clue. All he did is went on the internet, searched Google, and found something that agreed with his biases, and then he created a video on it. All right. Listen, please like this video, uh, subscribe, share it. There's some good scholarship in this video. All right. So until next time, peace.